Hello everybody. Welcome to our online demonstration of NGOsource. This is Michael DeLong with TechSoup, and I'll be your facilitator today. A little bit about ReadyTalk, the webinar format we'll be using. Everybody will be muted today, so if you have any questions about the content or how to use ReadyTalk, you can ask those via the chat box. We'll answer your questions either in the chat box or aloud with the presenter. If for some reason we don't get to your question, we will make every attempt to follow up with you following today's webinar. If you do lose your internet connection, you can reconnect via the link that was emailed to you, the same way you connected the first time. Just as a reminder, we are recording today's webinar. If for some reason you do need to leave the webinar early today, or you just want to review the information provided, you'll be able to access this recording, which we be sending out to all registrants this afternoon. Again, this is our online demonstration of NGOsource. I'm Michael DeLong from TechSoup, and with us today is Sheila Warren from NGOsource. As General Counsel of NGOsource and TechSoup Global, Sheila provides guidance on international philanthropy law, oversees the equivalency determination review team, and educates the philanthropic community about the requirements of international grant making. Helping us with chat today is Ali Bezdikian and Kyla Hunt, so you may see their names pop up in the chat box if you have questions. Just a little bit about our agenda today. Sheila will be giving us an overview of NGOsource, and we'll also cover costs and how to get started. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give it over to Sheila to get us started. So welcome, Sheila, and go ahead and unmute yourself and take it away.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'll just wait 1 second to share my desktop with you all. And while I do that, good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Michael mentioned, this is intended to be an overview of NGOsource. I'm going to get my slideshow started. That's what you will see. I'll be covering a little bit of the history of the service, a little bit about how we came to be where we are, and covering what launch really means for the service and for the sector. I'll also be showing you screenshots of our online portals and explaining to you how the service works, and walking a little bit at the end through cost, pricing, and how to sign up for the service. So with that, let's begin. NGOsource is a joint project of the Council on Foundations and TechSoup Global. It's an equivalency determination service that's designed to help U.S. grant makers streamline their international grant making process. You can see that's sort of our boilerplate on who we are and what we do, and I'll walk through what's happening and the history of how we came to be where we are. So, the Council on Foundations back in 2005 convened a group of 4 organizations, themselves, Foundation Center, Interaction, Independent Sector, to survey the field of international grant makers and NGOs to find out what could make their international grant making processes easier. We know there are challenges in international grant making that don't exist in domestic grant making that come primarily from U.S. tax law requirements that were promulgated by the Treasury Department and the IRS. The main source of these regulations and requirements is a revenue procedure, 92-94, which some of you may be familiar with, which governs the area of equivalency determination. Under U.S. tax law, there are 2 primary ways you can make a grant to an international NGO if you are a U.S. foundation or other type of U.S. grant maker. One is equivalency determination, which is what we cover with NGOsource. The other is called expenditure responsibility. NGOsource does not deal with expenditure responsibility, which is a process and methodology by which documents are collected, reporting is done on behalf of an NGO to a grant maker. It requires separate accounting, certain kinds of segregated accounts, and because that is so specific to an NGO and a grant maker's relationship, we don't engage in that particular endeavor. Equivalency determination, in contrast, is a process by which an analysis is done after the collection of a significant amount of information on an NGO. That is done before a grant is made, and it only needs to be done roughly every other year. I'll get into timing a little bit later. When you collect that information, and a qualified tax practitioner, a term I'll explain later, makes a determination that that NGO is the equivalent of a 501c3 U.S. public charity. That is, if that NGO were housed in the United States of America, they would be qualified to be a 501c3 public charity, not unlike TechSoup Global. Once that determination is done, the grant maker is permitted to treat that NGO as if it were a U.S. public charity for the purposes of U.S. tax law. What that really means at the end of the day is certain kinds of grants are possible with equivalency determination, also known as ED, that aren't possible with expenditure responsibility, also known as ER. Classic examples include general support grants and also capital expenditure, certain kinds of capital expenditure grants. Okay, moving on. Why did we choose to focus on ED? Well, as I mentioned, a survey was done. It seems like now back in the day, although it wasn't so very long ago. And what we found during that survey was that 90% of NGO leaders, 86% of grant makers, and 75% of service providers all agreed that if there were a way to get this information in one centralized place, it would be a significant benefit. We were also informed during that survey that grant makers often preferred ED, even though ER is still a very important tool in the grant maker's toolkit. There was a tendency to indicate that there would be a bias towards ED if only the process were actually easier, streamlined, and there were more clarity to what one was actually supposed to do. Here are some drawbacks of the current ED process. It's inefficient. Up until we received recent regulation, grant makers could not actually share NGO information and their analysis with each other. That is, if Foundation X determined that an NGO was the equivalent of a 501c3, they couldn't just turn around and hand off that information, that analysis and determination, to another foundation for its own use. Each foundation had to conduct independent analysis using facts about the NGO to come to their own conclusion about its equivalency to a 501c3 public charity. As you can imagine, this led to a lot of duplication of efforts. Multiple grant makers would go to the same NGO and ask for slightly different information. It's kind of like grant applications, as you might imagine. Proposals require slightly different budgets, slightly different information. And because of that, there was actually a tendency to hesitate before engaging in the ED process. It was inconsistent. 92-94 came out in, unsurprisingly, 1992. There were lots of changes in the world that came about after that time, and yet those changes were not reflected in the law, and it was unclear with the way the law was drafted what exactly a grant maker was meant to do. Meanwhile, the grant maker took on a tremendous responsibility for engaging in the determination. ED was very complex. You're dealing with NGOs in different languages and different time zones, and you're collecting quite a bit of information. If you had to go back as a grant maker and receive subsequent information, sometimes the time zone alone could add days, weeks, or even months to the process. And finally, ED was quite expensive. Using external legal counsel, and I used to be such external counsel, could often cost $5,000 to $10,000 for a legal opinion. That is for one grant to one NGO. In-house counsel also found this to be quite burdensome. So this is how EDs worked previous to NGOsource. Right? Here's Grantmaker A going to an NGO, maybe consulting a law firm. Meanwhile, Grantmaker B goes in, Grantmaker C. All these other people are consulted. And as you can see, our poor NGO, all they're trying to do is do their mission. Right? Maybe they had an amazing project that they had marketed to the community seeking grant funds, and all these grant makers A, B, and C wanted to support that project. But because of the sheer weight of the process, the time it took, the complexity, the poor NGO's resources wound up being diminished. That's not what we're trying to accomplish in the philanthropic sector, obviously. How does it work with NGOsource? Well, the beauty of NGOsource is because we are centralized and streamlined, all grant makers can come to NGOsource, place that request with us, and we handle all of the paperwork, the legwork, all of the analysis that has to be done on behalf of these grant makers. We use a series of global partners around the world. At present, we are launching with 7 partners, and I'll go into who they are later. Because they have language capability, native language in most cases, and they're in different time zones, that time lag and that complexity I was discussing earlier doesn't happen. So our partner in India is the one communicating with the Indian NGOs, explaining to them in Gujarati or Punjabi or Hindi or Marathi exactly what the information is that's needed and getting that information to us so we can do our legal analysis. As you can see, it all flows back in a very seamless manner through NGOsource to all of these grant makers. So what are the benefits of NGOsource? Well, we are a little biased, but we think there are many. A key one now, in the wake of recent regulations that came out in September, is a reduction of risk on the part of the grant maker. Because the grant maker can now rely on the analysis and determination made by NGOsource's tax professionals, who are qualified tax practitioners, the grant maker does not bear the liability of the analysis done by us. The process is streamlined, unlike the scenario I demonstrated with my favorite slide, which shows all of these various grant makers going to this NGO at different times and asking for different things. We have one process used for every NGO around the world based on legal analysis done by legal experts here, and we know that that's a process that can be relied upon. Grant makers don't need to have highly specialized staff. More specifically, they don't need to have their own qualified tax practitioner, whether that is internal counsel, outside counsel, a CPA, etc., on their staff. They can hire us to outsource all of that to us because we are that highly specialized staff. Again, the reduced grantee burden. A grantee can now submit the information once to NGOsource, and we actually run the timing for when we do a renewal. So rather than every grant maker having to go back at arbitrary times for them based on what their own analysis or grant cycle might be, we can actually make sure that information is kept up to date. Lowered cost is a full service, and I won't bother reading through the rest of these, but at the end of the day, we believe that NGOsource promotes tax compliance. It actually takes the ambiguity out of the ED process because we deliver clear standards, a clear process, and we think that will lead to a growth in cross-border philanthropy ultimately, simply because this barrier to entry that can often be quite high to leap over will be lowered. Many people agree with us. As you can see, here's a list of the funders who have generously given to get NGOsource off the ground. I should note that when TechSoup was selected to design and host and maintain the repository in NGOsource by the Council on Foundations in 2009, it was unclear when the guidance that would enable the launch of a service would come down. Nevertheless, this group of 16 funders, and there are actually a few more who've signed on in recent months, decided it was worth it to them to invest funding in the design and building of the repository so that when that guidance came down, which it did in September of last year, we would be able to move towards a very efficient and speedy launch. So how does it work? NGOsource is designed to be as low touch for the grant maker as we could make it. So all a grant maker needs to do is request an ED on what's called our Grantmaker Portal. It's an incredibly user-friendly website that you log into, and all you have to do is provide 2 email addresses and names at your NGO. We will check against our database to see if that NGO is already in our database and let you know if they are. And if they're not, you give us these 2 email addresses, and we're off and running. What happens the minute you request an ED on the portal is an email sent from us to your NGO. We also encourage the grant maker to send an invitation email directly to the NGO, encouraging that NGO to use NGOsource and to be as responsive as possible to the questions that we ask. Our global partners, and these are the countries where they're located, although we will be expanding that list later, and it includes Australia, communicate with the NGO, again, often in language and often in time zone. Upon launch on March 18th, the service will be available in French, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, and English. And shortly after that, we'll be rolling out in additional languages as we gauge demand around the world. We'll also be rolling out additional partners, again, based on demand and where we see the flow of grant making moving. Once the global partner has worked with the NGO to obtain the information that we need to do the analysis, that ED questionnaire is what we call it, the information we receive, will be locked and sent to San Francisco to our ED review team, which is comprised of exclusively qualified tax practitioners. If there are follow-up questions, we'll communicate either directly with the NGO, but in most cases with the global partner, so we can take advantage of that time zone and language benefit. We'll then determine if the ED is certified or not certified. If it is certified, you'll receive a notification both in your email as a grantmaker and on the Grantmaker Portal. If it is not certified, we will send you a customized special email explaining exactly why the NGO is not certified. I should note, it's important to realize that NGOsource tells you how to make a grant, not whether to make a grant. And specifically, it tells you whether ED is an available option for you. We do not engage in a qualitative analysis because the point of NGOsource is to really refresh and encourage a strong and healthy relationship between a grantmaker and a grantee. By eliminating the burden of this process, we actually facilitate the growth of that relationship and let your program officers or grants managers work with the grantee to support the mission of both institutions. So if it's not certified, the reasons might often be completely innocuous. Perhaps they had engaged in a little bit too much lobbying activity that year. In some places in the world, lobbying is an absolutely appropriate way of accomplishing a mission. Under U.S. tax law, there are limits on the amount of lobbying you can do. So it may well be that a year from now, that NGO might qualify for an ED, but at the current time it doesn't. We also educate NGOs about the reasons why they might not pass an ED analysis. Here are the global partners that are helping us upon launch. As I mentioned again, we'll be launching in Spanish, French, and Mandarin Chinese. However, these countries in the world, I should be very clear, these are not the only countries that NGOsource will cover. It is a regional model, so every country in the world, without exception, is covered by one of these countries. And as you can see, they are quite geographically disparate and dispersed, so we are able to cover the wide range of countries in the entire world. So why didn't we launch earlier? That's a question we get quite a bit. The reason I mentioned, the law that I mentioned earlier, the regulation, it's the Revenue Procedure 92-94. And as I mentioned, there were barriers to us actually launching. One of the key barriers was that the procedure seemed to suggest that only an organization's legal counsel could issue this opinion. That means either external counsel that was hired by the foundation or the grantmaker, or in-house counsel. At NGOsource, we are not actually the lawyer for Foundation X and Foundation Y. However, we are lawyers, and we are very qualified lawyers who are quite experienced in performing this service and this analysis. In 2012, the State Department, in conjunction with Treasury, made an announcement talking about new regulation that separated the need for that relationship of counsel to be counsel of record for the foundation, essentially, for the grantmaker. What that means is that NGOsource's lawyers can now issue EDs that grantmakers can rely on, even though we are not technically the attorneys of record for the foundation. What that did, it's very technical, but it got the lawyers at NGOsource, including myself, out of a number of state bar requirements, some of the privilege issues, some of those kinds of things that complexified this process significantly and made it impossible for us to launch and comply with all of those rules. Now those are not actually necessary and don't apply to us. All we have to do is be qualified tax practitioners, and we can actually issue these determinations that the grantmakers can rely upon. We have sought a legal opinion from Kaplan and Drysdale. They are a law firm out of Washington, D.C., who are our outside counsel. And that opinion is due to be in our hands by the end of February or earlier March. And we will be happy to share that opinion upon request with grantmakers who are seeking more information about the service. In essence, Kaplan has been through our entire process. They have actually taken a look at our questionnaire, at the way we train our partners, at the way we do our legal analysis, the documents that we keep. It's been a very, very thorough audit-like process of what we do here. And they are writing a legal opinion that in their expert judgment, what we are doing suffices to meet all of the laws and regulations in this area. So that will be something, again, we'll be happy to share. I received a question about how long the entire process takes, and so I'll address that now. It generally runs 4 to 6 weeks on average from the time, and I'll go back to the previous slide. From the time the grantmaker makes the request, we start the clock ticking, and it often takes, this might surprise you, 2 weeks for the NGO to even log into the system. The biggest lag in time is the NGO beginning the process and the NGO submitting the information. So that 4 to 6 week average comes from our beta period, but it's based almost entirely upon how quickly the NGO gets us the information. I'll tell you, somewhat interestingly, we discovered that the older an organization is, the longer it often takes them to get us the information that we seek. One of the things we require is the articles of incorporation or the governing documents of an organization. As you might imagine, for an org that was founded in 1922, that document might be sitting in some cupboard and it's crumpled and it's dusty and all these kinds of things, as opposed to an organization that was founded after the internet era who probably scanned in their documents, kept them online somewhere, and can easily upload them to us. That's just one example. Of course, there are several organizations who were founded a long time ago who are very organized and get us things very quickly. If we do not hear from your NGO within 2 weeks at any time, our global partners communicate with them every single day, right? So if after 2 weeks of daily communication and daily outreach to them, we have not heard a reply from your NGO, we will come to you as the grant maker and encourage you to send an email to your NGO, checking in with them, making sure that they're still on track with the process. We notify you at all times of where an NGO is in the process and where the ED is. Once the information is sent to us in San Francisco, it generally takes us 48 hours to conduct and complete the review and give you the analysis. So again, 4 to 6 weeks on average, definitely easier in certain countries, harder in other countries. It all depends on the law of that country, the operations of NGOs in that country, how robust the sector is, and most specifically, how quickly your NGO gets us information. All right. So this is the Grantmaker Portal. As you can see, it's a dashboard. It's designed to very, very quickly give you a snapshot of where all your EDs are in the process. Now these columns on the right-hand side, the different colored columns, mark where an ED is in process. That first column there actually indicates that we're waiting on the grant maker. So it may be that you completed a partial request, perhaps you had to go back and get a second email address, perhaps there was a payment hiccup, etc. So in that orange bucket, that's when we're waiting on you to actually initiate the request. The yellow column is the column in which EDs reside for the most length of time. That is where the NGO is submitting the information, working with our global partner, pulling together financial documents in a format that nobody would ever keep them, pulling together their governing documents, figuring out their lobbying activity, etc. The green column is where our legal review team in San Francisco is taking a look at the documents, doing their analysis, going back with questions if there are any, etc. And the blue column is a completed column. That does not mean it's the number of approved EDs. It means that it's completed. So the determination's been done one way or the other. There are different ways of sorting this. You can actually click on the RED request. That will sort by ED progress, due date, status, etc. When you make the ED request, as I mentioned, you provide 2 email addresses, the language in which your NGO prefers to communicate. The options, again, will be Spanish, French, Mandarin, and English at the outset, and we'll roll out other languages later. You let us know what their preferred language is, and you give us a due date. The due date cannot be prior to 6 weeks before the date of request, which gives us that window to actually make sure we can complete. Now again, our average is 4 to 6 weeks, and we do expect that in the vast majority of cases we will come in under that 6 weeks, and in many cases we'll even come in under the 4. That being said, just to set expectations with you and your staff and your NGO, we do require that that initial period be a 6-week period from the date of the request. This is an example of the questionnaire. As you can see, it's got prominent help button on the right. There are prominent help questions, help bubbles that if you hover over, you get helpful information that adds to the question on almost every line. And this is even just the organizational information, and we still have help text here. This is actually translated, this language right here, into the Spanish, the French, and the Mandarin Chinese. On the left side, there's a navigation, so your NGO can actually see as it goes through the questionnaire how much further it has to go. When a section is completed, a green check mark will appear, so they know that's done. When a section is not completed, a red exclamation point appears, so they know they have to go back and fill out the information. This questionnaire auto-saves, it is designed to be easily downloadable. We can email a copy to your NGO. We know that not all NGOs have web capability. Some of them are actually, it takes them quite a while to get to the internet cafe, or they're on dial-up or whatever it is. So we can mail this to your NGO if need be. We can send them a copy in email that they can fill out and then send back to us. They can download the whole thing and then upload it. There are a lot of options for how to submit this questionnaire. Of course, if they can, they do it on the web, but if that doesn't work, plenty of workarounds exist. We even have the capacity, believe it or not, for fax submission. So if the fax machine is something that's easier for your NGO, they can fax away, and we can receive the information on the other end at our global partner site and type it in for them on their behalf. Here's a version of the questionnaire in Spanish. And you can see the help bubble here popping up. So in this particular instance, cargo función is basically role, and we ask what is the role of the person who's filling out the contact information. And here are some examples, and we give many of what your role might be. So I wanted to flash this slide because there is a wealth of information on NGOsource.org, and I am going to go over to that site in a second and give you a quick tour of it and show you where some of the most helpful information is. But if there are questions, you can always email me directly. That's my address, sheila@NGOsource.org. Or you can email our team. There are plenty of ways to get a hold of us on that website, which I will now go to and hope that I don't, my tech, okay, here we are. Oh, right. Everyone can see that, right? I'm hoping everyone can see the website. Fantastic. All right, I've gotten confirmation. Excellent. So this is the NGOsource.org website. As I mentioned, it has a wealth of information. If you have questions, I encourage you to go over this tab to our FAQ, and I will click on that to just show you how many questions we answer. Right there, right? Everything from services and benefits, more questions about the liability and our standards. We know that is of concern to everyone's lawyers, and if you have an in-house lawyer, I'm happy to speak to them directly for you and explain exactly why this works and why we can be relied upon. But there are some questions there preliminarily. Everything about the certificate, membership, pricing, etc. We even go so far as to explain our data security. We are TechSoup Global, as you might imagine. Privacy and data security were quite important to us, and I can assure you that we do everything we can to conform to current Silicon Valley standards of how to protect the data of both you and your NGO. So on the home page, you can see a really quick infographic that describes what we do. It really is as simple as it looks. You apply online. You give us 2 email addresses for your NGO, a due date, and a language, and we do everything else for you. That's really how this works. We keep up to date with our news down here, and we actually have a really lovely section that shows impact stories. So as EDs come through, we tell the story of how that particular grant or just having the ability to do an ED one time benefited NGOs. We know it's a big complaint for NGOs that they get asked this information constantly by grant makers from varying places, and they have to give different information all the time. When they don't have to do that, it just frees up their resources to focus on their mission. We always get questions about pricing. If you go to the Get Started tab, all of our pricing is explained here in really clear terms. We have a membership fee that is based on the volume of EDs you think you'll be expecting. And that's broken down, as you'll see, into 1 to 9, 10 to 29, 30 to 59, and 60 to 99. So basically, depending on how many EDs you think you'll do in a year, and a good estimate is an average of what you've done the past 3 years. If you're brand new, we expect you'll be in the basic column, of course. Your annual fee for membership flows from that number. What those annual fees include in every case are unlimited recertifications and currently certified EDs. What does that mean? So at the beginning, as you might imagine, the vast majority really, of EDs will be new to our system. We'll be going to the NGO, our global partner will go to the NGO for the very first time, collect all the information for the very first time, and we'll be doing the analysis again for the very first time. Subsequently to that, we'll be doing a renewal. And that means that much of the information, governing documents for example, may not have changed. So what we do at the time of a renewal is we send the information back to the NGO and we say, is this still accurate? Please certify it's accurate. Please provide us maybe your last year of financials, update anything that needs to be updated, and we'll do a review. As you might imagine, in many cases, nothing changes. Or in some cases, just one thing changes that we have to go back and investigate. But it's obviously much simpler to do a renewal than it is to take a brand new NGO, brand new ED through the system. As a result, the price is a lot cheaper. It's a flat $850 to renew an NGO that's already in the system. And of course, there's a period of time during which a grant maker has requested an ED, and that ED is currently certified. In accordance with Kaplan and Drysdale, it is an area of ambiguity in the law exactly when an ED expires. And the view we are taking, with the support of Kaplan's to their legal opinion, is that you're allowed to, that you get the time period is to the end of the grantee fiscal, plus one more year. So that means if you come in at the beginning of close to the end of a grantee fiscal, you might actually get 1 month more, let's say, of their fiscal plus another year. If you come in at the beginning, you might get, say, 11 months of a grantee fiscal plus another year. So the time period varies. It depends on when your grantee fiscal is, not when you make the request. Okay, just to be clear about that. So when the renewal needs to happen varies. It can be as much as 2 years. It can be as little as a year. So during that time period, the NGO is actually currently certified. And because of that, the price is only $250. That means if Grantmaker A comes in and makes a request in July, and you come in and make the same request in October, you will benefit from the fact that NGO's ED exists in the system and pay a flat $250 to get that certification documentation issued to you by us so that you can make that grant. The price of the EDs, the new EDs, has a volume discount component that you can see right here on this website. So I encourage you to take a look. I should note, most importantly, that we are offering a trial membership for those grant makers who want to test the waters and come into NGOsource early. So between now and March 20th, we will be offering a 6-month trial membership during which you can get 2 new EDs for $19.99. That means there's no membership fee on top of it. It's an all-inclusive fee for a little under $2,000. You have 2 new EDs that you use or lose within 6 months. We think it's a great way to kick the tires, test the service, put a couple of EDs in here, as you might imagine, and help us populate the repository early. If there are any questions, please do feel free to ask. When you're ready to get going, you go back to the Get Started tab, and there is a membership registration form. One of the reasons we don't, so the way this works is you give us your information, who you are, what level of membership you're thinking about going for, how you'll be paying, credit card, check, etc. And then we collect just some basic info that's standard. How'd you hear about us? All that kind of stuff. How much grant making do you do? You know, you scroll through this nice thing and click. It's standard stuff. What we do is we do take a quick eyeball of the applications that come through, and that's for the protection of our NGO grantees. We want to make sure that there are no, how shall we say, evil elements that come in and get access to the system. As you might know, those of you who work in, for example, Eastern Europe, there is concern about governmental agencies' oversight and having too much information about grantees. We do ask for sensitive information from grantees that is legally required by U.S. tax law as part of the ED process. And sometimes NGO grantees are nervous. So we make sure to tell them we actually do a very quick cursory pre-screen of all applications that come through to make sure that no one slips through the cracks that would be inappropriate to have access to this information. Separately, we also want to protect the community. There are several kinds of organizations, foreign organizations, for example, for whom NGOsource is just not appropriate. And we want to make sure that they're not going down a path that doesn't actually make sense for them. Another note on grantee privacy. Before the grantee fills out your questionnaire, we inform them of the grant maker who made the request. So they have yet another opportunity to affirm that they know that grant maker, that they are comfortable with that grant maker, they're receiving their information, and that we can proceed. Those are the ways in which we confirm that the grantee is comfortable giving us the information. Again, we keep it very private and secure in our servers. The minute that the global partner is done reviewing the NGO questionnaire, it is locked for them and they cannot access it, and it comes strictly to the legal team in San Francisco, who are the only people that can actually access that information going forward. So that actually concludes the formal part of my presentation, and I'm quite eager to take questions from all of you that I believe are going to be thrown at me by my moderators who have been so gracious. So where should we begin?
Thanks, Sheila. That was very informative. It doesn't look like we have a whole lot of questions right now. We answered the one about the cycle. Are there any other questions from the attendees? Please feel free to post them into the chat box. Well, it looks like you just did such a great and thorough job, Sheila.
Well, I'm pleased.
I don't think anybody can even think of anything to ask.
Well, as and when questions arise, and of course they will, particularly from your lawyers, do feel free to email me directly or go onto our website. There are several options for who you can email for membership questions as a membership alias, just general information. I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. You can do that off our website as well. That will contain information. It comes out every 6 weeks, and it really kind of lets you know what other languages are we rolling out, what other partners are we adding. It'll keep you up to date as we go forward on where things stand.
And we do have another webinar later this month. Is that correct?
That's right. That's a question for you. We have a question for Michael, I believe.
Oh, there we go. How can we gain access to the recording and slides? Those will be sent out to all attendees later this afternoon. So whatever email address you signed up for the webinar with, we'll be sending out those links later this afternoon. So how do you secure NGO data, Sheila?
Sure, I can address that. So in addition to the ways that I mentioned where we lock the questionnaire at varying levels, so once the grantee has completed their submission, it locks and they're not able to go back into it. Of course, it's their information. Once the partner, the global partner, has reviewed the questionnaire, again, it locks when they submit it and they can't see it anymore. And it's set to us in San Francisco, and only a few of us here in the office can actually review that information. It is actually kept very secure. We use all of the standard SSL, all that kind of thing. And if there are questions specifically about the data privacy, I can put you in touch with our tech people who will be much more qualified to answer that question and give you a detailed response.
Great, thanks. So we have another question. To clarify, do you pay the annual fee plus, there's all kinds of questions coming in now.
Letting in.
Do you pay the annual fee plus the additional fee per NGO ED or NGO research?
That's right. So it is a two-pronged payment process. Your membership fee gives you access to the system. So you can go in, you can search the database, you can look for a water rights organization in the Sudan, for example, if you're so inclined. Then there is a per ED fee, and that per ED fee, as you'll see on the website, is based on whether it's a brand new ED, a recertification, or a currently certified ED. Now that top level, the brand new ED, does bring a volume discount, but the other two fees are flat. And again, it's all explained on the website, but I'm happy to take follow-up if there are more questions about that.
Great. And another question is there any reason why tax and estate professionals would prefer ER to ED?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate you asking. In our view, ER and ED are both essential tools in a grantmaker's toolkit. They're very, very different. They're very different processes. ER is often very useful if you're making recurring grants and you want to stage money. Sometimes it might be if you want that reporting back for whatever reason. If let's say it's a brand new relationship maybe, and you just want to have a little bit of comfort in that first year where you stage your grants quarterly, let's say, and you make sure that that NGO is really adhering to the budget and that they kind of set forward. ED is when you're going to be making, let's say, multi-year grants. You don't want to have to do tons of reporting back and forth. You want the NGO to have a little bit more flexibility in where they spend and how they spend. And really you want to front load a lot of the work. So again, ER is an ongoing process. ED is a very present tense, upfront process. And there's more information about this on our website. We have a whole section called What is ER and What is ED? And it links to a really fantastic article by my former colleague, Steph Pettit, that talks about the differences when you might use which. I encourage you to check that out too.
Thanks, Sheila. Excuse me. Another question from Jamie. If we make a second grant to a certified organization before the original certification we requested expires, would the certification still be valid?
Absolutely. So the certification is issued to a grant maker with an expiration date, and any funds transfer, it's about the date of the fund transfer, by the way, not the date of the expiration of the term. So the date the funds are transferred, as long as it is before that expiration date, you are good to go.
Great. And Dana wants to know if an international NGO becomes certified without a request from a grant maker.
That is an excellent question. So right now, we did get a cue from Treasury. It's not a legal requirement, I should be clear. We got a cue from them that they are more comfortable if we actually have the grant maker initiate the request. And that's because there is an idea that the grant maker is conducting some diligence prior to making the request. They're a little aware of this NGO, and so they come with kind of that stamp of approval of the grant maker on them. Now, our intention over time is to allow NGOs to renew themselves into the repository. That is, to collect and pay the fee to keep their information up to date and do their own renewals. And we are going to reevaluate whether NGOs can, as we call it, self-seed into the repository annually. And we'll reevaluate kind of where we are, how much demand there is by NGOs, all those kinds of things. It's my personal hope that we will, in short order, be able to allow NGOs to see themselves as a repository. But right now, that's not the approach that we're taking.
Okay, and Elizabeth wants to know if whether you are the grant maker requesting first or as a $250 ED, will you get access to all of the NGO documents or just the legal option?
Great question. So what you get as your legal opinion is a certificate that is very, very straightforward that says your name, their name, expiration date, and what tax code section they are exempt under or equivalent under. That is the case regardless of if you're currently certified or the first one. In addition to that certificate, everyone also gets a packet of materials that, again, we put together with Kaplan that is essentially in a spreadsheet kind of format. It's got columns and a table, and it checks off all the legal requirements. So it's kind of like a legal opinion you get from your lawyer, only rather than being 40 pages long, it's about 2 pages long, and it goes through and very quickly ticks off those requirements so that you can see exactly how we got to where we got. And if you have questions, you can always follow up.
Great. And Kyle wants to know if a member wishes to allow others to know that they requested an ED, are you willing to make that public?
It is at the grant maker's discretion. So right now, our default is that nobody will ever know the name of the requesting grant maker. And that's because just because an ED goes through doesn't necessarily mean the grant maker will make the grant. Perhaps their priorities change. I mean, who knows what might happen. Perhaps there's a, God forbid, a disaster somewhere else in the world, and they divert funds. So we do not ever share the requesting member's name. If a member wanted to make that public, we absolutely would accommodate that and allow other members to know which grant maker made the initial or subsequent request. Absolutely.
Thanks, Sheila. And can you search by the name of org in the database?
You can. That's actually one of the best ways to search. You can type in by name, partial name. You can also look by country, and you can look by general subject matter.
Okay, and another question from Kyle. Is it possible that you will adjust the ED process now that you have in place if you learn from members that they would like it to be done in a different way?
That's a great question. And one thing I can assure you of is that any changes we make will be in compliance with the law. We are driven by the law. The risk is shifting to us. So it may be that members would really love something, but it just doesn't comply with the law, in which case we wouldn't be able to accommodate. That being said, we are certainly open to feedback about the portals, how they work for you, et cetera, and we welcome that at any time. All right. Well, it looks like that's the last question.
All right. So do you want to talk about the next upcoming webinar?
Oh, sure. So the date of that webinar is
the 26th
of February. Just confirming. I didn't want to say anything wrong. And it will be somewhat similar to this one. We do intend for the first few of these to be a little bit of a repeat of what we've said today. So there are colleagues of yours, either at your organization or other organizations who you think would be interested in what we had to say. We certainly welcome their participation. Going forward, we will switch up the format of the webinars. Probably by around the late spring or summer. We'll be continuing with webinars, but we'll have a slightly different topics. It will be a little bit more of an explanation of ED, less of an overview of the process, perhaps diving more into exactly how our process works, our legal process works, how we've come out on certain tricky legal questions, things like that. So, and that will be in response in part to member demand for a webinar in the first place and be certain topics.
Sounds good. Well, I'm really looking forward to those. I just want to remind everyone that we are here at TechSoup, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And TechSoup is part of TechSoup Global, Our mission is to work towards the day when every nonprofit, library, and social benefit organization on the planet has the technology, knowledge, and resources they need to operate at their full potential.
We're getting a couple more questions.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
We're going to roll back here and go to some more questions.
Yeah, from Mary Ann.
Can you, just to clarify, if an NGO is certified for a nonprofit and a nonprofit A, and nonprofit B wants to make a grant to the same NGO, nonprofit B would have to pay a fee for ED?
That's right, and that's where that currently certified category comes into play. So if Grantmaker A comes in and they would pay that brand new ED fee, which again varies based on the volume that that Grantmaker is assuming they're going to take through the system, Grantmaker B would pay that $250. And so, and I know there's a little bit, people sometimes ask, well, should I wait until someone else puts my NGO in? And we think it really evens out. So there are several large grant makers who are willing to assume that initial fee, seed the repository, get NGOs in. And we think the reality is that if everyone just follows their grant cycle and process, it'll always be the case that they wind up with some new fees, some current certified, some renewals, et cetera. So that is a great question. I think we have another one too.
And so if people want to see you in person, do you have any conference appearances coming up?
We do, and thanks for asking. We will be at the Grant Managers Network Conference in St. Petersburg, Florida in March, and we will have a presentation there. We'll be actually doing a live demo of the service, walking you through all of it, and of course taking sign-ups at that time. I should note the March 20th deadline for that promotional package was timed to actually end the day that the Grant Managers Network Conference ends. And the hope is that a lot of grant managers will come there ready to sign up for that service. We'll also, of course, be at the Council on Foundations Conference. So it's their annual conference, and we'll have a presence at every conference the Council puts on because, of course, they are our partner in this endeavor.
Great. And we've got another actually really good question, useful question from Anthony. Will you be able to make information available regarding what organizations fail to qualify?
Yeah, great.
So that other grant makers won't request for the same type of certification?
It's a great question. So we will not, when you search through the system, we won't flag that an NGO did fail to certify. And that's because, again, there are grant makers who maybe will not realize that that is not a qualitative statement about the NGO. So for their protection, we don't put any kind of negative mark or whatnot in the system. However, if you were to come in and request an ED on an NGO that had failed to certify for an ED, we would not charge you for one thing. We would refund any money that had come through for that ED, and we would explain to you exactly why that NGO had not qualified for the ED at that time. As I mentioned earlier, the reasons are often extremely innocuous. It's just something about their lobbying or dissolution clause or whatnot. In some cases, it may be that you want to work with them as a grant maker, or we can work with them to sort of remedy whatever the deficiency was. Now, there's one exception. If we do become aware of fraud or, God forbid, any kind of terrorist activity by an organization, we will tell you that that had happened. We will let the grant maker know that this is an issue, and until you come back to us and say that in your opinion you have cleared that NGO of whatever the very serious issue was, we will flag that that is not an appropriate NGO recipient for grant funds of any type, regardless of whether they are ED or ER or anything else. So.
And I think you might have just answered this in your last answer, but Martin wants to know, will you tell the NGO why they didn't qualify and what they could possibly do to change things in the future?
It's a great question. There are certain very simple things that we do share with the NGO. For example, the dissolution clause is something that is a bit of an odd requirement under U.S. law. It's often very tricky to explain to NGOs. That is something that we explain exactly why that's needed and even offer language that can be used to help them pass that particular test. We really leave it up to the grant maker. So we actually make sure that the grant maker gives us that lead, and we check with the grant maker and say, this is why the NGO failed to certify. We would like to go back to them and explain, here are the things we can do, this and that. I want to be very clear. We do not coach NGOs on how to pass the certification. We are objective tax practitioners. That is our job, to do objective analysis of the system, of the NGO's documents and everything else, to make sure that we are doing that determination in as objective a fashion as possible on behalf of the grant-making community. That being said, there are, again, these very simple things that are oddities, which we are happily explain to the NGO as part of our service.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sheila. Very informative talk today. I wanted to remind everybody that our webinar sponsor is ReadyTalk. And wanted to thank Sheila again for her great presentation. Let everyone know that we will be sending out a recording. And again, Sheila, if you could repeat your email address so that people can email you questions.
Absolutely. It's Sheila, S-H-E-I-L-A, @NGOsource.org.
Great. And if everyone could just take a few moments to fill out the survey. It'll pop up on your screen as you leave today's webinar. We'd really appreciate your feedback. And the surveys help us figure out how to do these even better in the future. So thanks everybody for coming, and have a great day.